Yes, it was a great pleasure for me to hear all the lectures and the discussion. And it is even more pleasure for me that I can now give some answers. Only some, because I have to answer to 7 very elaborated presentations. And if I would make an elaborated answer, we would sit here up to deep in the night. That will not happen. I follow in my replies the sequence of the presentations. That is to say, I begin with Brian Biggs. And naturally, only some points, Brian. The first is you said that highest courts can or may be wrong. Naturally, they can. But being wrong is compatible with raising a claim to correctness. And by this, the story becomes interesting. For the wrong decision of a highest court can be corrected. We have the institute of overruling. That is possible. And therefore, the claim to correctness make them legally defective, the decision. Not only morally defective, legally defective. And that is, for the future, a very important thing. Wrong theories in physics have often been corrected by later generations. Wrong decisions by court can corrected by later court decision. But that is only a small point. My most important point is your remarks to performative contradiction. Performative contradiction is the main element of my claim to correctness element. You quoted my sentence, X is sovereign, federal, and unjust state. And I think you agree a little bit that is somehow absurd. And absurdity, if you agree this is absurd, absurdity results from a contradiction. That is the oldest form of a philosophical argument. And what is contradicting in case of the claim of correctness? We have a contradiction between what is explicitly said and what is implicitly presupposed. And now the question is this an argument? Brian Biggs has said that concerns only language, not morality or law. I like this argument, for it is a decisive point for me, that it concerns only language. For this, the contradiction is stemming from rules, that is here pragmatical rules of speech acts, necessarily presupposed in speaking. But, and that is a wonderful thing, language here refers to morality. In speech act, say, sciences, physics, they make speech act too. They raise a claim to truth. In law, there is raised a claim which I call a claim to correctness, which includes normative element, different as in natural sciences. Well, that is my point. And therefore I say, and Finnis, you quoted him or mentioned him, said in his answer to my attack on Finnis that I make conceptual claims. You can have different concepts of what is conceptual. And we have semantical connections and pragmatical connections. Pragmatical connections concern speech acts as such, not only propositions. That is the point. But nevertheless, as they are a linguistic claim, we can have a concept of conceptual claims which includes pragmatic contradictions. That's my point. My last point, and I start with a small remark on a very funny thing. Joseph Ratz, who is a positivist, I start another way. The claim to correctness is, for me, in my theory, the main source of non-positivism. It is the Archimedean point of my system. Now, Ratz, my system is a non-positivistic system. Ratz is a positivist, a radical positivist. One can even say an exclusive positivist. But he agrees with me that law necessarily, not contingently, necessarily raises claims. But he says that is not a claim which leads to morality, but only a claim of adequacy as with respect to all human activities. Robbery, the work of a group of bandits, is a human activity. And they claim to to work successful. And they claim to be good robbers, earning a lot of money without doing as little work as possible. And then they are successful. And he says, while the bandits have their claim, the law has their claim, but with morality, all these claims has nothing to do. My answer to this is, and that is at the same time my answer to you, that we have to distinguish two formal structures of the claim to correctness. In the bandit system, the claim has a structure. What we do is correct for us. In the Nazi system, the claim was what we do is correct for the German, for us. But the claim to truth is a claim that it is correct for all. Naturally, in the Nazi time, we had the idea of German mathematics or German physics, the greatest nonsense you can imagine. But the claim in sciences is a universal claim, a claim what is true for all. And now, law's claim to correctness is a claim what is correct for all. But to be sure, and I will come back to this point, for all from the point of view of the legal system in which the decision is made. But that is enough. That is my point. And last point, Finnis, Ratz, as a positivist, connects law with a necessarily race claim. Finnis says that law does not necessarily raise a claim correctness. And he is a non-positivist. You see how interesting the discussion is. he gives the claim a contingent character, but my thesis is, and I cannot elaborate it more intensively in this evening, that it is a necessarily raised claim. So much for Ryan Biggs. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, the next lecture was the lecture of Peter Koller. You had first made many points. I select only ones. The first, what exactly do the officials of a legal system claim? And you say, an official does not claim that the legal order or the legal system as a whole is correct. That is, that all decisions by all judges are correct. That is, that the decisions they have not had made are correct. They don't claim it. They claim that my decision is correct, the decision they make. And they naturally must agree in the thesis that all judges must raise this claim. But there is a distinction between claiming that for all judges that their decision is correct by one judge, or by simply saying they all make this claim, and then you could add, but there are unfortunately some who are not very successful. That can be said. That is, we have not what I would like to call, what you said, the aggregation thesis. I would like to reject it. Next point, objective correctness and subjective correctness. Well, one of the main problems of the claim to correctness thesis is the Mackey problem. Inventing right and wrong. Mackey has a wonderful expression, the error theory. He says, in moral argumentation, we raise a claim to correctness, but this is an illusion. For there exists no objective moral correctness. And indeed, the error theory or illusion theory would be correct, that would be a meta-ethical sentence, would be correct if there would not exist moral correctness. Then it would be illusion to raise a claim to correctness. If there were only, as emotivist like Stevenson say, and so weiter, decisionist, non-cognitivist, absolute relativist, and how their names are all, if they were right, if Kelsen, for instance, were right, that every practical idea, for instance, yes, it's written in the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law. Some people think that concentration camps or genocide is okay, and the other not. Some people like chocolate cream, some citron cream. If that were the same with genocide and human rights and cream, then the claim to correctness would break down. And naturally, Peter, in order to say that the claim to correctness thesis has adequate basis, I must show that there, not in all cases, but in some cases we can say there are moral propositions which are right. And for that reason, I have invested in my life a lot of time in attempting to prove that human rights, for instance, also other things, human rights are correct. And when a normative proposition is correct, a normative proposition is correct when it can be justified. It is just this reason why I connect the theory of law with discourse theory. Therefore, what you call, Peter, social acceptance is not enough. Then you have a very, for me, very interesting point. That is my last point, if you allow. The multitude argument. I hear very often, Robert, you make radical, simple distinctions. But in the world, there is a multitude of things. Many conceptions of human rights, many conceptions of rationality, and so on and so on. And you have said we have a multitude of claims. I say we have some distinctions in this area, but one of the main aims of science, and here is nearly the only point in which I agree with Niklas Luhmann, his reduction theorem. It is the main obligation of science to reduce complexity, not to enjoy complexity. And many scientists in the humanities nowadays enjoy complexity. I suffer on complexity and try to reduce it as it is done in natural sciences. That is my answer, Peter, for your wonderful paper. The next, Ralf Poscher. It is a great pleasure that we are now in the third stage of our discussion. I have 2 days before I traveled to Tallinn received a book translation from Brazil. There is a discussion between me and Eugenio Buligin from Buenos Aires, one of the most important legal theorists of the last century. And we had 3 rounds in the last 20 years about, my God, the claim to correctness. And these 3 rounds are now translated in Portuguese and published. And in some weeks or months, these 3 rounds will be publicated in Spanish language. And it is a wonderful thing. And I must give a short answer. And you say that the ideal ought is unnecessary. We don't need it. My first point is we need it because, or say me 2 things. We need it. My first argument is a sequence argument. The sequence argument. Oh, let me see. I must write that. I just invented this concept, and I write it down in order not to forget it, for I will drink wine in some minutes. Sequence argument. And the 3 stages I would like to present here. And The first stage is O-I-T. It is it is obligated in an ideal way that P. And why is this interesting? It is interesting between, it is possible to have O, I, P, and O, I, not. That is a conflict of principles or norms. Now, you say we can reconstruct this phenomenon also by optimization requirements. I first present the sequence and then I give an argument for the adequacy of having both. And not only, you say, if it is obligatory in an ideal sense, then here you cannot read what this means, that it is obligatory in an ideal sense. There's nothing how to solve this problem, the contradiction, the collision problem. The next stage is if this is obligatory in an ideal sense, then it is obligatory to opt P. That is, the optimization is a method of solving this non-function. That is my next point. And optimization is the same of proportionality and proportionality analysis, that is the weight formula, the weight formula. Now you say what is at the stage in a collision? What is this, in a case of collision? Then we have only argument against this is when we speak of a collision of rights, we speak of a collision of two normative entities. That is my point, and not P. For instance, if you go rent a new flat, and you want to hang up things on the wall, then you must, if they are have a certain weight, you must drill. Drill. You must drill holes into the wall. And if you drill holes in the wall, you change the wall. But there is no conflict between the drilling instrument and the wall. If there should be, there is no conflict between facts. The facts do not contradict. If you want to have a normative conflict, you must say the wall should remain as perfect as possible. And the things you want to hang up should hang on the wall as secure as possible. But these are two norms. And my attempt is an attempt to make a conflict as clear between two norms, and the optimization requirement is necessary, but is only the next step. And therefore, my thesis is that this construction gives a full picture only referring to optimization requirements gives an incomplete picture. And I simply repeat my old thesis that we can, on this basis, make a clear distinction between rules and principles. There are different rules, there are different principles, but that is a categorical distinction, and the mere fact that principles are related to rules does not say that the distinction not exists. But that I cannot elaborate here. That is my answer, and thank you very much. I'm happy to have now the third round, have had the third round with you. Next, Spark. Yes, my first point is the question of the real and the ideal dimension. I like very much. I like very much the list you presented between the 8 stages we have. And the first stage, necessary correctness, I think there we can agree. And then, if correctness, then satisfaction, but not actual satisfaction, but the claim to the attempt, the approximation to satisfaction. Therefore, that somebody, so many people claim that what they say is true. But the claim to truth is not a guarantee to truth. The claim to correctness is not a guarantee of correctness. That is my first remand. And if you have not positive law, anarchy, then the claim to correctness is not satisfied. I completely agree with it, but this could be more elaborated, and I might short. If we would, I hope we have another opportunity. But at this point, I want to introduce a distinction many have referred implicitly to. We must distinguish, and that could perhaps even a little bit more elaborated here, between 2 claims we find in law. That is the distinction between first-order correctness and second-order correctness. First-order correctness is pure moral correctness. If you refer only to justice and not to the institutionalization of law, then you have a wonderful claim, an idealistic claim. But it leads to anarchy, civil war, and loss of the advantages of cooperation, and so on. Therefore, the claim to correctness, and now please listen as exact to me as possible. The claim to correctness refers to substantive moral correctness and institutional correctness. That is, the moral claim to correctness refers to the correctness of positivity. And that is the reason why Jeremy Waldron qualifies Kant as a positivist. Because Kant in paragraph 44 said, and in the postscript to the second edition of the Doctrine of Right in 1897, he said, follow the law in everything. Follow the authority which has power about you. but Kant has moral reasons for it. And if you read Kant more exactly, the story becomes completely different than Jeremy. My God, make no Kant interpretation. Please excuse this. Then you have said Alexy only explicates, not analyzes. I think Brandom, for instance, making it explicit. I think, only a short remark, explication in philosophy is the main method of philosophical analysis. That is my remark on this, to make it, because of the time, as short as possible. Jan Siegmann. Let me look. Where I have it. Yes. Only Jan, where he is sitting? Yeah, yeah. Jan, I like your paper very much, and I have only mainly two points to your complex elaboration. You say that the distinction between a real and a factual dimension is necessary, a necessary feature of law, but not the, you quote me here, the single most essential feature of law. And you say that the real dimension can also exist in normative systems which are not legal systems. For instance, in traditional customary systems and so on, especially customs, might here. For customs have indeed social efficacy. Social efficacy. If today it's a dinner, I would not take my meal from my plate, but from the plate of my neighbors. It would be impossible. Perhaps you would never again invite me. The social pressure against persons doing such things is enormously high. Or casting my wine in the face of my colleagues. And the sanction would be that you tell it to other people what I have done and so on. Nobody would do such things. Much more effective are such moral rules than many legal rules, especially of taxes and so on. But, Jan, please, perhaps I have it not made clearly enough. I refer with the concept of the real or factual dimension not only to social efficacy, that would not be sufficient, but to authoritative issuance and social efficacy. That is to say, all of the authoritative issuance presupposes the institutionalization of the legal system. And by this, the formal principles as you mentioned it. That is my first point. And my second point, I like that even more, is that you say that it is not enough to have a dualistic theory as I have it. You need a trialism. And your example of trialism is, and I read from your handout, a trialism seems to be necessary, distinguishing analytical, empirical, and normative aspects of law. In my dual nature thesis, we indeed have the empirical dimension. I agree here completely with Josef Ratz as law as fact in the authority of law. And the normative aspect as the claim to correctness and the implications of the claim to correctness, that is things like the argument from injustice, the Rat pro formula and principles theory and so on. And you say, we must also have an analytical dimension. And we indeed must have an analytical dimension. But the necessity of the analytical dimension does not imply that the dualism is to be substituted by trialism. That is my main point. And to argue for it. We have two kinds of positivism. That is much more important than the distinction made by Jules Coleman between inclusive and exclusive positivism. Much more important is the distinction between naturalistic and non-naturalistic positivism. Naturalistic positivism we find, for instance, I think most clear from all, in Karl Oliver Kroner, in his Law as Fact, I think from 1939? Yes. Law as Fact, Oliver Kroner. He explicitly argues against Kelsen's normativism, which especially in the first edition, 1934, of the Pure Theory of Law, even talks about the ideal dimension of law. And by the ideal dimension of law, Kelsen says that the ought, the norm, as a proposition, that is, as a matter of sense, exists. And Stanley Paulson and I always think about of Kelsen ever have heard anything about Gottlob Frege, one of my most favorite authors. After Aristotle and Kant, in my list of favorite philosophers, directly Gottlob Frege follows. And Frege says, a third world, I quote him, the thought, a third world must be assumed or presupposed. And the third world is the world not of the physical, not the physical world, not the psychical world, which Oliver Kroner accepts, the two, but the world of ideas. And Kelsen is a positivist, but conceives the norms as ideas. And Jan, I have been very happy when I saw your think this evening the first time, because I had a very hard job, but I have long finished it. I think that were 2 or 3 weeks ago. I gave, and we have here Ralf Poscher, one of the organizers of the Kelsen conference in Freiburg, a great conference, and I had there a lecture about Hans Kelsen's legal theory in the system of non-positivism. And there I have discussed exactly this point and have said a positivist can have an ideal dimension in an analytical sense. I say it again. A positivist, Kelsen is our example, can include in his theory an ideal dimension in an analytical sense. Now, you say, I must include in my system analyticity. But analyticity in this sense is not essential or decisive, either for being a positivist or being a non-positivist. But my dualism is an instrument to distinguish as clear as possible between positivism and non-positivism. Therefore, I need the analyticity element. I don't need it. And can remain with my dualistic construction. Well, the time is going. That was Jan and Jan Siegmann. And Endicott. I had forgot you. But my papers, I have written during this conference this day 8 pages of the lectures. And now I have produced a chaos. And let me say, yeah, Endicott, I have found you. I liked very much your question concerning principles of interpretation. I start with a distinction. We have to distinguish forms, and now I use the terminology I used in my theory of legal argumentation, forms and rules of interpretation. Forms, and also forms and rules of general practical discourse, but forms of forms of interpretation. For instance, we have the wording, semantical interpretation. How to make it? No, simply what it is. Then intentional interpretation, the subjective intention. That is one point to which you can refer in interpretation. Then historical interpretation. How the law is, what is the history of this law? A very bad form of interpretation, but you can use it. Then systematical interpretation refer to other norms of the legal system, first and foremost to norms included in the constitution or in international law. So that is, and then objective teleological interpretation. Radbruch was a man who wanted it. German courts are very strong on the line of teleological, objective. Which interpretation serves a rational purpose, even if the parliament has followed an irrational purpose. And then the rules of interpretation. And these rules of interpretation must be, I have called them rules, but you must know when I wrote the theory of legal argumentation, I have not yet the distinction between rules and principles. I used the concept of principles, but in the classical sense, that principles are norms at a very high level of abstraction. And then we are exactly at Joseph Rath's point, that is the degree of generality is a matter of degree, not an either-or one, as principles maintains. And in recent times, I have tried to elaborate the old theory into the framework of principles theory. And the most important principles of interpretation are first, and the most abstract in importance, are the principle of legal certainty. The principle of legal certainty is a formal principle, and it requires that we follow what the rules that have been institutionalized by empowered authorities. That is the principle of legal certainty, or the principle of procedurally empowered authority. And to this we can add the principle of democracy. And on the other side, we have the principle of substantive correctness. First and foremost, the principle of justice. And there can be collusions between these principles. And here we have to work with, as always in principle theory, we have to make a balancing. And I have developed in my old theory of legal argumentation the following preference rule. Arguments based on the wording of the statute and the actual intention of the legislator precede all our other arguments, except we have clear and specific reason not following this rule. That is, it is a burden of argumentation or a burden of proof if you don't want to follow the wording of a statute. But I think, and in your rules now, we have elements of this. When you say it, principles conferral of lawmaking power, conferral of interpretative power, that are institutional arguments. And then you continue, committee with lawmakers. That is a little bit away from a strict priority of authority of the lawgiver. And then interpretation is to be distinguished from the application of law, and then humility. And then equity. It is, I think, a principle of interpretation, but a principle that must be balanced with the principle, let me say as short as possible, the principle of authority. Principle of authority. And the principle of authority has, because of the dual nature of law, and by the dual nature thesis, the second order correctness is implicated. And the second order correctness refers first and foremost to positivity and only in addition to substantive justice. Therefore, I think indeed that the idea of principles of interpretation is an idea without which you cannot have an adequate theory of legal argumentation and interpretation. That is my answer to your wonderful lecture. No, have I? Yes? Yeah, Matt Susi. Matt, I was very happy to hear your lecture. It was a great pleasure for me to write my small commentary on your paper. And I have naturally a lot of remark in details. But if we would go into it, especially I would like to discuss with you your refined version of the internet balancing formula. But I will not do this. Your remarks to internet vulnerability I found very interesting. And I want to make a general remark. I have it here. A general remark. This remark concerns the concretization thesis. You have had it here on the slide. And I make a comparison of my weight formula with your internet balancing formula. And for this I need again the blackboard. Oh my God. Have I 5 or 10 minutes? Yes, you have. In my theory, before I learned your theory, I had only two stages. Stage one. Wait. Wait for. And as Matsui has said, he's completely right. The weight formula is completely abstract. It applies to all constitutional rights. And a remark to Ralph Poscher, I think even to human dignity, but that is highly contested. More abstractness is not possible. More abstractness is not possible. And that naturally is my aim. I like to develop theories which are as abstract and theoretical as possible. But everybody who knows my writings, I always apply my theory to practically relevant cases and try to show that they can help us in solving these cases. And the weight formula is applied in some countries in a bad way, but in some countries, in some constitutional courts, very well. And I like to visit constitutional courts. I have in this year already visited a little bit too much, 3 constitutional courts, and discussed with them the application of my weight formula. And then I have the abstract level, and then we have that are the presidential rule. An example of a presidential rule concerning a collision between freedom of speech and personality right is the Lebach judgment about a criminal band killed 4 soldiers in a munition depot in Germany, Lebach, in order to rob weapons. And so on and so on. They were sentenced, and one of the 3 was not present at the murdering. And he was sentenced to 6 years. And after 4 years, he normally comes free, according to German penal law. And the TV, we had in these days only 2 TVs, accompanied ZDF, both public, has a reality film about the murdering in Lebach. At the beginning, they presented a picture of the criminals, then their name. Then they showed the small city where they lived, and they made it in this city. They were fully identified. And the Constitutional Court said that report in TV immediately after the crime is okay. They had a balancing between personality right, as in the Delphi case, personality right and freedom of expression. And they said, now made a concrete rule. And you know, perhaps my principal theory has only 2 laws. The law of balancing, which I had permanently changed and transformed the law of balancing into the weight formula. The weight formula is identical with the law of balancing, albeit in a completely other theoretical form. But I have a second law, the law of colliding principles. And this is completely different as with the balancing, law of balancing. I have never needed to change it. The law of colliding principle says that the conditions under which the one principle precedes the other, these conditions are the first part of a rule, the condition, which expresses the legal consequences required by the preceding principle. And in Lebach, the rule was, if the report is a repeated report, it was about a severe crime. It was a severe crime, for which there is no actual interest in information in the population, and which violates the right to resocialization as an implication of the personality right. Under these four conditions, personality right precedes, that is, it is forbidden, the sending it in the TV, precedes freedom of speech or freedom of TV report, as you want. That is the concrete rule. And now, my decisive point here is, and now I have, we have transformed the number 2 into and now, at stage 2, the the Internet balancing formula of Maat-Susi. What is now the Internet balancing formula? And that is my last remark. The Internet balance, and you always say in your writing that with the IBF, the Internet balancing formula, you refer to what the court, the presidents of the courts. And that is the most important basis of the application of the Internet balancing formula by artificial intelligence. That is, I had in my old theory the concrete rule, one besides the other, a real sum of rules. And the Internet balancing formula is an attempt to create a systematic connection of the different concrete rules, not up to this systematized. And therefore, about many details we can discuss, but I think such a medium level will be a great project. Not only, that is a short remark I have, it is not only that the internet providers can make use of it by connecting it with artificial intelligence, it is also extremely interesting for the theoretical idea of systematization, as it was also the main idea of high-level jurisprudence. The best example for this is Carl Friedrich von Savinky, who the system of the present Roman law. He wanted a system that is Begriffsjurisprudence, conceptual jurisprudence, and this level has a dual character. Level 2, it is of enormously practical impact for doing the artificial intelligence supervise, and it is of highly theoretical interest. Therefore, it is you do not say that explicitly, but I think that should be expressed. And with this, I end my presentation. I have said to you before I went to this point that I will need half an hour or 45 minutes. Now I have needed nearly exactly 1 hour. I have to excuse for reading 15 minutes too long. Thank you very much.